Nobody on Flight 227 knew that the quiet 12-year-old girl in seat 14A held the only knowledge that could save them from a death spiral. While passengers saw just another kid playing on her tablet and flight attendants spoke to her in baby voices, Maya Chen carried secrets about spiral recovery that most professional pilots never learn. In 60 seconds, when the jet would begin spinning uncontrollably toward the mountains, everyone's survival would depend on whether adults could overcome one deadly assumption: that children have nothing important to say. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across the terminal as 12-year-old Maya Chen walked quietly beside the gate agent, her small rolling suitcase bumping along behind her. She wore a simple purple hoodie and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, looking like any other unaccompanied minor making a routine flight. The agent smiled down at her with that particular tone adults reserved for children traveling alone, asking if she was excited to visit her grandmother in Seattle and whether this was her first time flying by herself. Maya nodded politely, giving the expected answers while clutching her tablet and a worn backpack covered in generic cartoon stickers that made her seem even younger than her 12 years. The gate agent handed her boarding pass to a flight attendant named Jessica, a cheerful woman in her 30s who immediately adopted the gentle, slightly louder voice people used when speaking to children. "Well, hello there, sweetie. I'm Jessica and I'll be taking special care of you today on Flight 227. Do you need help finding your seat?" Maya shook her head but followed obediently as Jessica led her down the jetway, chattering about how the flight would only be 2 hours and how they'd have snacks and drinks, and wasn't flying so much fun? Other passengers boarding behind them smiled at the sight of the young girl traveling alone, some thinking how brave she must be, others already dismissing her as just another kid they'd barely noticed during the flight. Maya settled into her window seat in row 14, carefully stowing her backpack under the seat in front of her while keeping her tablet on her lap. The middle seat remained empty, but an older businessman took the aisle seat, briefly glancing at her before burying himself in his laptop, clearly uninterested in making conversation with a child. Jessica returned to check on her, leaning down with that bright smile and asking if Maya knew how to buckle her seatbelt and where the safety card was located. Maya nodded again, and Jessica patted her shoulder reassuringly before moving on to other passengers, satisfied that her young charge was settled and safe. As the aircraft filled with travelers, Maya appeared to be doing exactly what everyone expected from a kid her age. She pulled out her tablet and earbuds, seeming to focus on games or videos like any other preteen would during a flight. The couple across the aisle noticed her and exchanged knowing looks, remembering their own children at that age, completely absorbed in their devices. A woman in the row ahead turned around briefly, offering Maya a kind smile and asking if she was doing okay, speaking slowly and clearly as if the girl might not understand regular conversation. Maya smiled back sweetly, thanking her politely, maintaining the perfect image of a well-mannered child who presented no concerns to anyone around her. What none of them could see on her tablet screen were the detailed aviation accident reports she was reading, technical documents about flight dynamics and emergency procedures that would confuse most adults. What they didn't know was that Maya's father had been a commercial airline pilot for 15 years before his sudden death from a heart attack 8 months earlier, and that he had spent countless hours teaching his daughter everything he knew about flying. From the time she was 6 years old, Captain David Chen had taken Maya to flight simulators, explaining every instrument, every procedure, every emergency scenario with the same seriousness he'd used with his first officers. He'd never treated her like a child when it came to aviation, believing that knowledge could save lives and that age didn't matter when understanding how aircraft really worked. After her father's death, Maya had become obsessed with studying aviation accidents, reading through National Transportation Safety Board reports like other kids read adventure novels. She'd watched every air disaster documentary, studied every emergency landing, memorized every recovery procedure from every major incident in aviation history. Her mother had worried about this fixation, thinking it was an unhealthy way to grieve, but Maya's school counselor had assured her it was just the girl's way of staying connected to her father's memory and would fade with time. No one understood that Maya was actually learning, absorbing technical information about flight dynamics, aerodynamics, and emergency procedures that even many pilots never fully mastered because they'd never needed to use them in real situations. Flight 227 pushed back from the gate right on schedule, and Maya felt the familiar sensations of the aircraft being towed backward, then the rumble of the engine starting up. The businessman beside her didn't even look up from his spreadsheets. Jessica came by one more time to check that Maya's seatbelt was fastened, speaking in that cheerful, simple voice and telling her that takeoff was the most exciting part. Maya smiled and nodded, not mentioning that she could identify they were using a reduced thrust takeoff based on the engine sound, or that she knew they were probably carrying extra fuel based on how long the taxi was taking, giving the pilots time to balance the load. The takeoff was smooth and unremarkable, the Boeing 737 climbing steadily through the morning sky as passengers relaxed into their seats, some dozing off, others reading or working on laptops. Maya watched the ground fall away through her window, tracking the aircraft's climb angle and mentally calculating their rate of ascent based on landmarks she could see below. She knew they'd level off at about 35,000 feet for this route, and that the flight path would take them over the mountains before descending into Seattle. Her father had flown this route dozens of times and had told her about the weather patterns, the typical turbulence areas, and the beautiful views on clear days like this one. An hour into the flight, Jessica came by with the snack cart, offering Maya a choice of cookies or pretzels and asking what she'd like to drink in that same gentle, patient tone reserved for children. Maya asked for apple juice and pretzels, thanking her politely while other passengers barely looked up from their phones and tablets. Everything seemed perfectly normal, just another routine domestic flight with nothing to distinguish it from thousands of others happening that same day across the country. The pilots in the cockpit were probably having casual conversation, monitoring their instruments out of habit more than concern, expecting to land in Seattle in just under an hour with no issues worth mentioning in their post-flight reports. But Maya noticed something that no one else did. She felt a subtle change in the aircraft's vibration, a slight irregularity in the engine sound that probably wasn't noticeable to passengers who didn't know what to listen for. She'd spent so many hours in cockpits with her father that she developed an almost intuitive sense for when something wasn't quite right with an aircraft's systems. She looked out the window and saw that they were entering an area of clouds, nothing that looked particularly threatening, but she also knew that weather radar sometimes missed pockets of severe turbulence, especially in mountainous regions where air currents could become unpredictable and dangerous. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and the captain's voice came over the speakers, calm and professional, asking flight attendants to take their seats due to expected turbulence ahead. Passengers groaned and put away their laptops, fastening their seatbelts with the casual annoyance of people who'd experienced rough air before and weren't particularly concerned about it. Jessica quickly collected remaining cups and cans, moving efficiently through the cabin and checking that everyone was buckled in before strapping herself into the jump seat near the rear galley. The businessman beside Maya sighed and closed his laptop, clearly irritated at the interruption to his work but not worried about any actual danger. The turbulence started gradually, just gentle bumps and swaying that made some passengers grip their armrests but didn't cause real alarm. Maya could feel the pilots making small corrections, the aircraft responding normally to their inputs as they navigated through the rough air. But then the bumps became harder, more violent, and she heard the engines changing pitch as the pilots adjusted power settings to maintain their altitude through the increasingly chaotic conditions. Passengers who'd been calm moments before started looking nervous, and someone a few rows back gave a small scream when the aircraft dropped suddenly, that stomach-lurching sensation of falling that made everyone's hands tighten on whatever they were holding. Then everything went wrong in the span of just a few seconds. A massive downdraft caught the aircraft like a giant hand swatting it from the sky, dropping Flight 227 several hundred feet in an instant while simultaneously pushing it sideways with tremendous force. Maya heard a loud bang from somewhere in the aircraft structure, felt the plane shudder violently, and then suddenly they were rolling, the horizon through her window tilting at an impossible angle as the aircraft began to spiral. Passengers screamed, loose items flew through the cabin, and the engines roared as the pilots desperately tried to regain control, but the aircraft kept rolling, kept spinning, entering a full uncontrolled spiral that sent them plummeting toward the mountains below. The businessman beside Maya was pressed against his seatbelt, his laptop crashing to the floor as the centrifugal force of the spiral pinned everyone against their seats. Through her window, Maya caught flashes of sky, then ground, then sky again as they spun, the world rotating around them in a terrifying blur. She could hear Jessica and the other flight attendants screaming along with the passengers, could hear the overhead bins starting to break open, could feel the G-forces building as the spiral tightened. The aircraft was shaking so violently that she could barely focus her eyes, and the sound was deafening, a combination of screaming people, roaring engines, and the shriek of air rushing past the fuselage at speeds it was never designed to handle. In the cockpit, Captain Roberts and First Officer Kim were fighting desperately with controls that weren't responding the way they should. The severe turbulence had damaged something in the control system, maybe the hydraulics, maybe a structural component, but whatever had happened meant that their normal recovery procedures weren't working. Captain Roberts pulled back on the yoke, trying to stop the roll, but the aircraft barely responded. He reduced power, trying to slow their descent, but they kept spinning, kept falling, the altimeter unwinding at a terrifying rate as Flight 227 spiraled toward the ground. First Officer Kim was working through emergency checklists, trying different control inputs, attempting to reset systems, but nothing was stopping the spin. The G-forces were becoming unbearable, pressing everyone down into their seats with crushing weight while simultaneously pulling them sideways as the aircraft rotated. Maya's vision was starting to gray at the edges, her body experiencing forces that humans weren't designed to withstand for more than brief moments. She knew from her studies that people could black out in sustained high-G situations, that pilots in aerobatic aircraft wore special suits to prevent blood from pooling away from their brains. She knew that everyone on this aircraft, including the pilots, was in danger of losing consciousness if the spiral continued, and if the pilots blacked out, there would be no recovery at all. Through the chaos and noise and fear, Maya's mind went to something her father had taught her about unusual attitude recovery, about a specific technique that airline pilots rarely trained for because commercial jets almost never got into situations like this. He told her about a military procedure, something fighter pilots used when recovering from spins, a counterintuitive technique that involved briefly increasing the spiral before recovery could begin. He'd explained that sometimes the normal recovery procedures didn't work when an aircraft was too deep into a spin, when the airflow over the control surfaces was too disrupted, and that pushing further into the spin could actually help reset the aerodynamics and make the controls effective again. She remembered her father's exact words, could hear his voice in her head despite the screaming around her and the roar of the aircraft tearing through the air. If you're ever in a spiral that won't stop with normal recovery, you have to be brave enough to make it worse before you can make it better. It goes against every instinct, but sometimes you have to push into the spin, accelerate the rotation, and that can unstick the airflow enough that your controls start working again. Then, at exactly the right moment, you reverse everything and pull out hard. Maya knew she was just a 12-year-old kid, that no one would listen to her, that even suggesting she knew something about recovering from an uncontrolled spiral would sound insane to the adults around her who were all screaming in terror. But she also knew that in another minute or less, they'd hit the ground and everyone would die, and that doing nothing guaranteed that outcome. She had to try, had to somehow get this information to the pilots, had to make them listen even though she was just a child and they were trained professionals who'd never take flight advice from a passenger, especially not a little girl. Maya unbuckled her seatbelt, which was incredibly dangerous and difficult in the G-forces they were experiencing, but she had to reach the flight attendant call button, had to get someone's attention. The businessman beside her was unconscious, slumped in his seat, and she could see others passing out too as the sustained G-forces drained blood from everyone's brains. She pressed the call button frantically, knowing the flight attendants might not respond because they were strapped into their jump seats experiencing the same forces, but it was her only way to communicate with the cockpit. Jessica, despite being terrified and pressed hard against her jump seat by the G-forces, saw the call light and heard the chime from Maya's row. Training took over even in crisis, and she reached for the interphone, pressing the button to call the cockpit even though her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold the handset. Captain Roberts, who was still conscious but barely, heard the chime and grabbed the cockpit interphone, thinking maybe a flight attendant had critical information about structural damage or could see something from the cabin that would help them understand what was wrong with the aircraft. Jessica's voice came through shaking and barely audible over the noise. "Captain, the little girl in 14A is trying to tell me something. She says she knows about spiral recovery. I know it sounds crazy, but she's insistent." Captain Roberts would have dismissed it immediately under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances and they were out of options. Every procedure he'd tried had failed, they'd lost 3,000 feet in less than 30 seconds, and his vision was starting to tunnel from the G-forces. He made a split-second decision that went against all his training about taking flight advice from passengers, especially children. "Put her on," he yelled into the interphone, his voice strained from the physical stress of trying to maintain consciousness. Jessica, moving with incredible difficulty against the forces pinning her down, managed to grab a handset with a longer cord and stretch it toward Maya's row, holding it out to the girl who was clinging to her seat. Maya grabbed the phone, and even though she could barely breathe from the G-forces crushing her chest, she forced out the words as clearly as she could. "Captain, my dad was David Chin. He flew for Pacific Airways. He taught me about deep spin recovery." She had to pause to gasp for breath, the G-forces making it almost impossible to fill her lungs. "You have to push into the spin first, add power and increase the bank angle, then at max rotation rate cut power completely and reverse all controls at once. It resets the airflow over the control surfaces." My dad said it only works if you do it exactly right and you have to time it perfectly. Captain Roberts had about 2 seconds to decide whether to trust flight advice from a 12-year-old girl or to keep trying procedures that clearly weren't working. He knew the name David Chin, had met him at pilot conferences, knew he'd been an excellent aviator and instructor. The fact that Chin had taught his daughter advanced recovery techniques was insane, but no more insane than their current situation. They'd lost 4,000 feet now, maybe had 20 seconds before impact with the mountains, and his conventional training had completely failed to stop the spiral. "Kim, I'm going to try something," Roberts shouted to his first officer, who was still conscious but barely responsive. "I'm pushing into the spin." He did exactly what Maya had described, adding power and increasing their bank angle, which made the spiral worse, made the aircraft rotate even faster, made passengers scream even louder as the G-forces intensified beyond what anyone thought they could endure. For 2 seconds that felt like an eternity, Flight 227 spun even more violently, and Captain Roberts wondered if he just killed everyone by listening to a child's advice. Then, at what he judged to be maximum rotation rate, he cut the throttles to idle and simultaneously reversed all his control inputs, pulling the yoke back into the opposite side of the spin while pushing hard on the opposite rudder pedal. For a moment, nothing happened and he thought they were dead, but then he felt the controls bite, felt the aircraft respond, felt the spiral beginning to slow. The rotation rate decreased, the bank angle started coming back toward level, and suddenly they were no longer spinning but diving at a steep angle toward the mountains that were now terrifyingly close below them. Roberts pulled back hard on the yoke, using every bit of strength he had left to raise the nose, fighting the aircraft's momentum and the screaming speed they'd built up during the spiral. The aircraft groaned and shuddered, the G-forces reversing direction now as they pulled up from the dive, and passengers who'd been pressed down into their seats were now thrown forward against their seatbelts. The altimeter was unwinding through 3,000 feet, then 2,500, and Roberts could see individual trees on the mountainside as he fought to level off. First Officer Kim, recovering consciousness as the G-forces normalized, grabbed the yoke to help pull back, both pilots straining together to overcome the aircraft's downward momentum. The mountains were so close that passengers on both sides could see details of the rock faces and forest, could count seconds before impact, but Flight 227 was slowly, agonizingly slowly, beginning to level off. The nose came up, the vertical speed decreased, and at just under 2,000 feet above the mountain peaks, the aircraft finally leveled out, flying straight and controllable again. The cockpit was silent except for both pilots' heavy breathing and the normal sounds of the aircraft systems. Captain Roberts' hands were shaking on the yoke, his entire body drenched in sweat, his heart pounding so hard he worried he might have a heart attack. First Officer Kim was crying with relief, not bothering to hide it, and neither of them could quite believe they were still alive. Behind them, in the cabin, passengers were sobbing, some were vomiting, many were still unconscious, and flight attendants were beginning to move through the aircraft checking for injuries even though they were shaking so badly they could hardly walk. Captain Roberts picked up the interphone again, his hand trembling. "Jessica, is the girl okay? The one who helped us." There was a pause, then Jessica's voice came back, also shaking. "She's conscious, Captain. Seems okay physically. I think she saved everyone's lives." Roberts felt tears in his own eyes now, something that had never happened in 25 years of flying. Tell her thank you. Tell her we're going to make an emergency landing in Boise, we're too damaged to continue to Seattle. And tell her that her father would be proud." Maya was still holding the interphone handset, listening to the captain's words, and she finally let herself feel the fear she'd pushed down during the crisis. She started crying, really crying, and the businessman beside her who'd regained consciousness put an awkward hand on her shoulder, not knowing what to say but understanding that this child had somehow just been involved in saving his life and everyone else's. Other passengers who'd been close enough to hear fragments of what happened were staring at her with expressions mixing disbelief, gratitude, and confusion about how someone so young could have known what to do. The rest of the flight to Boise was tense and quiet, passengers still shaken, flight attendants moving carefully through the cabin dealing with minor injuries and trying to calm people down. Maya sat looking out the window watching the landscape below, thinking about her father and how all those hours he'd spent teaching her had seemed like just quality time together but had turned out to be life-saving knowledge. She thought about how adults had seen her as just a kid, had spoken to her in simple terms and smiled at her like she couldn't understand complicated things, and how none of them had imagined that a 12-year-old girl could know advanced aviation procedures that most pilots never learned. When Flight 227 landed in Boise, emergency vehicles were waiting, and the landing was harder than normal because of the damage to the aircraft's control systems, but they were down safe. As passengers evacuated using the stairs that had been rolled up to the aircraft, Captain Roberts and First Officer Kim came out of the cockpit, and Roberts immediately walked to row 14 where Maya was waiting with Jessica to exit. He knelt down so he was at eye level with her, this tall, gray-haired captain in his uniform getting down on one knee to look a 12-year-old girl in the eye. "Maya, I need you to understand something," he said, his voice serious but warm. "What you did today, the knowledge you had, the courage it took to speak up when you're just a kid and no one expects kids to know these things, you saved 142 lives. Your father taught you well and he would be incredibly proud of you right now. I'm proud of you and I'm grateful that you were on my aircraft today." Maya just nodded, unable to speak because she was crying again, and Roberts pulled her into a hug that she didn't resist because she needed to be held by someone who understood what had just happened. On the ground, as investigators began examining the aircraft and interviewing passengers, the story of what happened spread quickly. News crews arrived, wanting to interview the young girl who'd helped save a commercial flight, but Maya's mother, who'd been called and was on her way to Boise, had instructed through lawyers that her daughter was not to be interviewed by media. The National Transportation Safety Board would need to talk to Maya eventually, as part of their investigation into what had caused the spiral and how the recovery had been accomplished, but for now she was just a frightened kid who wanted her mother. The investigation would later reveal that Flight 227 had encountered what meteorologists called a microburst with rotational wind shear, an extremely rare weather phenomenon that had caught the aircraft at just the wrong angle, and that the severe turbulence had caused a fatigue failure in one of the hydraulic system components, reducing the pilot's control authority enough that normal recovery procedures couldn't overcome the spiral dynamics. The combination of circumstances was so unusual that it had never been fully addressed in training programs for commercial pilots, which was why Captain Roberts' conventional approaches had failed. Maya's contribution to the recovery became part of the official accident report, though the NTSB was careful to note that the captain made the final decision to attempt the unconventional technique and that his skill in executing it was what actually saved the aircraft. But they also acknowledged that without Maya's knowledge of deep spin recovery procedures, knowledge that she'd gained through non-traditional education from her pilot father, the outcome would almost certainly have been a fatal crash. Her story prompted discussions in the aviation community about whether commercial pilots should receive more training in unusual attitude recovery and whether the industry was too quick to dismiss knowledge sources outside formal training programs. For Maya, life slowly returned to something like normal, though she was now known at school as the girl who saved the airplane, which made her uncomfortable because she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd been terrified and had shared information that might help, and who'd been lucky that the pilots were willing to listen and skilled enough to execute the recovery. She continued studying aviation, but now with encouragement from her school and even some mentorship from Captain Roberts, who stayed in touch and who told her that when she was old enough, he'd personally recommend her for any pilot training program she wanted to attend. The passengers from Flight 227 who'd been close enough to know what happened would never forget the image of that small girl in her purple hoodie, who everyone had seen as just another kid needing supervision, calmly explaining advanced flight procedures to a captain while the aircraft spiraled toward certain death. Many of them sent letters or gifts thanking her, and some of them shared their stories publicly, making sure people understood that expertise and knowledge could come from unexpected sources and that age didn't determine whether someone had valuable information in a crisis. Jessica, the flight attendant, requested to be on Maya's flights whenever she traveled to visit family after that, wanting to personally ensure the girl was taken care of, but also wanting to be around someone who'd shown such remarkable courage and presence of mind. She never again spoke to Maya in that simplified, talking down to children voice that adults so often used, instead treating her as someone worthy of respect and serious conversation, regardless of her age. The businessman who'd been sitting next to Maya, whose name was Robert Patterson, later discovered that he'd been completely unconscious during the most critical moments of the crisis and had come close to dying without ever knowing what was happening. When he learned that the girl sitting beside him had been instrumental in saving his life, he reached out to Maya's family and set up a college fund for her, specifically for aviation education, with a note saying that he owed her his life and wanted to ensure she could pursue her dreams of following her father's career path. Years later, when Maya did become a pilot, flying first for regional airlines and eventually for major carriers, she would tell student pilots in aviation safety seminars about Flight 227 and about what she'd learned from her father. She emphasized that knowledge could come from anywhere, that expertise wasn't always where people expected to find it, and that in emergency situations, being willing to listen to unconventional sources of information could mean the difference between life and death. She talked about how her father had never dumbed down aviation concepts for her just because she was young, had trusted that she could understand complex ideas if they were explained properly, and had given her knowledge that eventually saved lives. She also talked about the assumptions people made based on age, about how every adult on Flight 227 had seen her as just a kid who needed supervision and simple explanations, who couldn't possibly have valuable knowledge about serious technical subjects. She pointed out that this same assumption could be dangerous in other situations, that dismissing people based on age or appearance or any other superficial characteristic might mean missing critical information when it was most needed. The aviation industry, she noted, had been particularly guilty of this kind of thinking, having a rigid hierarchy where information was expected to flow in certain directions and where challenging authority or bringing in outside perspectives was often discouraged. The story of Flight 227 became a case study in aviation safety courses, not just about the technical aspects of spiral recovery, but about crew resource management and the importance of considering information from all sources during emergencies. It prompted changes in how flight crews were trained to respond to unusual attitudes and how they were encouraged to think about unconventional solutions when standard procedures failed. Maya's role in the incident became an example of how effective communication and willingness to listen could enhance safety, regardless of where information originated. For Maya personally, the experience shaped her entire approach to flying and to life. She never forgot the feeling of being dismissed as just a kid by everyone around her, even as she possessed knowledge that would prove crucial to their survival. It made her determined to listen carefully to people regardless of their background or position, to value knowledge wherever it came from, and to remember that expertise and wisdom didn't have age requirements. She made it a point throughout her career to take young people interested in aviation seriously, to answer their questions thoroughly, and to never speak down to them the way so many adults had spoken to her. She also never forgot those terrible moments when Flight 227 was spinning toward the mountains, when she'd had to overcome her own fear and self-doubt to speak up and offer help, when she'd known that adults wouldn't want to listen to a child but that staying silent would doom everyone aboard. That memory stayed with her as a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing meant making yourself heard even when people didn't want to listen, meant trusting your own knowledge even when it seemed impossible that you could have something valuable to contribute. Captain Roberts retired a few years after the incident, but he attended Maya's graduation from flight school and pinned on her wings personally, telling her that she'd been a better teacher to him that day than anyone he'd encountered in decades of flying. He admitted that his first instinct had been to dismiss her information, that everything in his training and experience told him not to take flight advice from a 12-year-old passenger, but that desperation and a split-second recognition of her father's name had made him willing to try something that seemed insane. He credited her not just with saving lives but with teaching him humility and openness that made him a better pilot in his final years before retirement. The other passengers from Flight 227 moved on with their lives, but many of them never forgot what happened that day and how close they'd come to dying. Some of them kept in touch with each other through a survivors group, sharing their experiences and supporting each other through the trauma that such a close call inevitably created. They invited Maya to their gatherings when she was older, and she sometimes attended, grateful for the connections but always slightly uncomfortable with being treated as a hero when she felt she'd just shared information her father had taught her. Maya's mother eventually made peace with her daughter's passion for aviation, understanding that it was genuinely her calling and not just a way to stay connected to her late father's memory. She attended every milestone in Maya's aviation career, proud but always a little worried, knowing better than most people how dangerous flying could be and how quickly routine flights could turn into life-threatening emergencies. But she also knew that Maya had been given an extraordinary gift by her father, both in knowledge and in the passion for flying that they'd shared, and that trying to keep her from pursuing that path would be wrong. The tablet Maya had been holding during the crisis, the one that adults had assumed contained games or social media but actually held detailed aviation safety reports and technical manuals, was later donated to an aviation museum as part of an exhibit about Flight 227. It sat in a display case alongside pieces of the damaged hydraulic system that had failed during the incident, a visual reminder that knowledge and preparation could take many forms and that the tools of salvation might look ordinary and unremarkable until circumstances revealed their true significance. In the end, the story of Flight 227 became more than just an account of a near disaster and successful recovery. It became a story about assumptions and expectations, about how society's beliefs about age and expertise could blind people to valuable knowledge that existed outside traditional channels. It became a story about the importance of comprehensive education, about a father who'd loved his daughter enough to share his professional knowledge with her completely and without condescension, treating her as a worthy student rather than just a child to be entertained with simplified explanations. Most importantly, it became a story about courage, about a young girl who'd found the strength to speak up in the most terrifying circumstances imaginable, who'd overcome both her fear and the certain knowledge that adults wouldn't want to listen to her, and who'd persisted because she understood that lives depended on sharing what she knew. That courage, that willingness to make herself heard despite every social pressure telling her to stay quiet and let the adults handle things, was perhaps even more remarkable than the technical knowledge she possessed. Maya carried that story with her throughout her life, using it to encourage others to speak up when they had valuable information, to trust their own knowledge even when others dismissed it, and to remember that expertise and wisdom could come from unexpected places. She made sure that the lessons from Flight 227 weren't just about spiral recovery procedures or aircraft systems, but about human behavior and the importance of listening and the dangers of assumptions based on age or position or any other superficial characteristic. Flight 227 landed safely that day in Boise because of a combination of factors: a father's dedication to thoroughly educating his daughter, a girl's courage in speaking up during crisis, a captain's willingness to listen to an unconventional source, and the skill to execute a dangerous recovery procedure under impossible conditions. It was a reminder that survival often depends on more than just training and procedures, that it requires openness to unexpected solutions and the humility to accept help from places we'd never thought to look. And somewhere in the mountains over which Flight 227 nearly crashed, marking the spot where 142 people almost died but were given another chance at life through knowledge passed from father to daughter and shared at the most critical moment, the sky remained clear and peaceful, holding no evidence of the drama that had unfolded there except in the memories of those who'd lived through it and in the story that would be told for generations about the girl who was just a kid, until she wasn't.